preliminary discussion, Felix Flicker's book, The Magic of Physics. I haven't finished the book fully. However, I still wanted to put this out because I think one of the main thoughts of the book is really very powerful, I'm not sure how the end of the book will change that. And I'll do a formal description of the book. But now I just want to bring across this thought. So what Felix does in this book, this is a popular physics book, and he's trying to make the case for condensed matter physics. But he does it in a very nice literary way, and he's trying to say that nature has a language, and physics is the discipline, the tasks itself. We're trying to understand this language. And condensed matter physics in particular is trying to understand the language within the context of matter. That's why it's called condensed matter physics, which has a very nice side effect, if you want, which is we can build technologies on top of it. Doesn't mean you can't build technologies and other things, but this is a very peculiar characteristic of condensed matter physics. So it's a language, it's kind of like the hieroglyphs of Egypt. You're trying to decipher a code, and the code is in terms of particles and momentum and position and spin and location and time, and a lot of these things are a lot of the things that we use, the vocabulary that we use in physics, is trying to help us bridge the gap between that microcosm, in particular the micro. It doesn't have to be micro, it can be macro too, but the small and the stuff that goes on within the small, and then gets to what we call an emergent effect, which is when the macro takes over, and that's what we see humans. See, there's a problem. There's a translation problem between the small in the sort of substrate and the particles and what we see, and that is physics. And if we want to build the Golden Gate Bridge or a car, an electric car, whatever we want to build, we need to understand what's going on in the small and try to understand that language, but more importantly also try to understand the translation from that small to the large, to the emergent, because that's what we interact in. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's June 11th, 2023. This is Krim Telco. For today, the fund is up 4%. The market's up 0.5%. For the year, we are up 110%. The market's up 11.5%. We're outperforming by 98.5%. Let's talk about this book, The Magic of Physics by Felix Flicker. I think it's an interesting book in many ways. Let me just give a quick anecdote of how I came to read the book, actually. I met Felix Flicker online, not in person, but I've heard an interview with him on Brian Keating's podcast, Into the Impossible. And he just came across as an interesting person. He's a physicist, he's a martial artist, and he connects martial arts with physics in the same way he connects language and with physics and nature. And his main, I think, the way, let's say, if I had to summarize his worldview, Felix Flicker's worldview is that there is a hack, there is a shortcut towards the inner workings of the world. There is a way to understand the inner workings of the world. And those inner workings are revealed to us in something, and we have to find a way to name that thing. So it all starts with language. The way we humans operate is through language. Once we have the language, then we can start focusing on that, on whatever we found. Let's say if we understand the spin of an electron, if that is something we name, this is a spin, that thing, the rotation of that particle, it's called a spin. And now let's look at that spin, and maybe we can build a computer device based on that spin. He's talking about magnetronics, for example, spintronics, which could be the next revolution in computing, because we could use the spins of electrons as a way to store information. So there is this underlying dynamic that we call nature. It talks to us. We perceive it. Now, we humans have a human scale. There's a scene in the book where he talks about scales. He talks about the growth of an olive tree, which for us humans looks like it happens once a year. But for the tree, that 1 year is nothing compared to the lifetime of the tree. And then that lifetime of the tree is a very different situation from the perspective of the mountain and the geology of the earth and then the universe and so on and so forth. So I think perspective is a very, very important thing. It depends how you look at things, from which perspective, and it changes everything. So the human perspective is what we call the macro of things. So when we build the Golden Gate Bridge, or when we build a Tesla car, we build a battery, let's say we build a lithium-ion battery, we're exposed to certain macro events or certain emergent factors that have an underlying language. They are connected to the underlying fundamental forces of nature, the particles and the forces, and all of that stuff. And trying to understand that connection is really what physics is. That's what science is. So deciphering the language of nature. And mathematics helps us. That mathematics is not the language of nature. I disagree with Bob's Techmark there. Because mathematics is something we came up with. It's a shortcut that helps us understand nature, but it also fails. For example, mathematics is not very good at understanding biology, or in general, incredibly complex systems are very difficult to understand with mathematics. So maybe machine learning can help us there, or other types of AI, because they represent nature in different types of concepts, let's say algorithms that then feed data and give us predictions about what might happen next without really understanding what's going on. So let's get back to Felix Flicker's book again. I think the main point I want to bring across in this episode is that you need to have a language to understand what's going on. I think you can apply this to economics, for example, also to the business of hedge funds. Let's say in my book, in my memoirs, Love Story, I am in a passage now where we're going to China the second time, me and my partner Zovinar, and we're trying to understand what's going on in China, but as far as, for example, massive steel production, overproduction of aluminum and steel, and things along those lines are concerned. So we're looking at these things and we're trying to understand them, and we really are able to understand them, which is amazing. But the point again is, like, you have to sort of name things. You have to give things names. You have to put names on things and the concepts and the processes, and then you understand the sort of bigger macro picture. The Chinese aren't stupid. They don't overproduce stuff just for the sake of overproducing stuff. Let me dwell on this example a little bit. So if you take physics, okay, you take condensed matter physics, and you try to understand superconductivity, for example, which is something I've been working on recently. So to understand superconductivity, you have to understand, you go down to the level of electrons, and you try to understand why is it that electrons flow through this particular matter, for example, liquid helium cooled down to 2 Kelvin is a superconductor. And why is that? How is that? So you need to understand the electrons, but then you have to have an explanation that sort of combines. You have to try to understand relationships between electrons, and that's where the BCS theory comes from, trying to understand superconductivity. And the analogy in the hedge fund business, for example, and take this passage in my memoirs, which is you have a situation where back in, let's say, 2009, and that was particularly characterized by China investing a lot in infrastructure to overcome the great financial crisis, which started in 2008. But with that, there was also a massive wave of overproduction of steel and cement and aluminum and other heavy industries. Now try to understand that. Try to understand why is it that the Chinese are overproducing. It requires an understanding, and the question is similar like in physics. At which level should I analyze this? For example, Austrian economics always goes down to the human action, right? It's the human action, it's the human. But if you, which will be the equivalent of understanding let's say, the electron and the Schrodinger equation and all those sort of things. However, just understanding human action is not going to be enough. You need to understand the relationship between now back to China. You need to understand the relationship between the Chinese entrepreneur or the Chinese official and its government. You need to understand history. You need to understand, in particular, let's say in this particular case, what happened is that during the Mao times, the Great Leap Forward, and then those sort of developments in the history of China, lots of towns were built with captive energy and raw materials, in particular energy. So captive energy. In this case, we have very low-grade coal, which is based in a place, and there's a steel factory which takes advantage of that, which kind of takes the low-grade coal and exports that coal through monetizing, through steel, into the processing industries, which then take the cheap steel and produce, I don't know, refrigerators, and then somehow they sell that to the rest of the world. So there is this massive infrastructure that has been built during the Mao times through coercion, not commercial aspects in any which way, and that has led to the massive overproduction of steel and refrigerators and so on and so forth. So you need to understand the relationships between the entrepreneurs and the government and the history. And that is, you have to have a language. You have to have a language, and then you can start building a theory and relationships. In this particular case, I think you have a very good explanation. And why is this explanation very good? Because now you know what to look for. Let's say if you're an investor in the steel industry globally, you need to understand why the Chinese are overproducing. And once you understand why they're overproducing, you can then also find trigger points when it's maybe time to buy steel or keep shorting steel, so on and so forth. Back to physics, back to Felix Flicker. So the same way applies to physics. Physics is the vocabulary of nature. That's what physics is. And understanding that vocabulary helps us build technologies that which is really like a narrative, if you will. It's like take a building a lithium-ion battery is almost like writing a poem based on the vocabulary of nature. So taking physics and then executing through engineering is like writing a poem with the words of nature. Now, what does that mean for us? Of course, in practical terms, and that's something Felix Flicker, I think, wants to get across. You need to have names for things, and that's what science is. That's what papers do. They create theories and build names. What is the spin of an electron? What is the Avogadro's number? What is momentum? What's the Schrodinger equation? All these things are just names for things that we can use to then build technologies on top of it. So that's really the purpose in the end. I think that's a very beautiful way to look at the world, and it's very helpful to look at the world. And the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. And I think reading this book, The Magic of Physics, is a beautiful narrative about physics and about the importance of physics for computation and technologies. And that is what investment and wealth creation is all about. Lastly, I also want to say, for people who are debating, should I study science or engineering, I think this is a beautiful book because it gives you a sense for what physics is, which is finding the vocabulary of nature, and engineering, which is then using that vocabulary to create things. So to summarize, Felix Flicker, The Magic of Physics, it's a beautiful book about the language of nature, which that's what we call physics. So the study of physics is to try to decipher the language of nature the same way, let's say, we decipher hieroglyphs of the old Egyptians. So this is really what physics is. Of course, the language of nature is a lot more complex than the hieroglyphs, and therefore it's also much more difficult, but that's what physics is. And engineering would be using that language to create a narrative, in other words, to create technologies that are built on that language. And that is the essence of wealth creation. Science and technology and progress, all of that is built on understanding the vocabulary of nature and then using it to build technologies on top of it.